Welcome, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. I am not in your faculty and in your discipline. I'm actually in the medical school. And that is because my research interests are in human reproduction and male fertility. But I've got a lot of experience about communicating science. So don't worry too much about the topic and of what I'm in. Just think about some of the concepts that I'm going to talk about, and I'll kind of illustrate some of the things I've done along the way. The invitation was to give you a brief introduction to science communication and why it's a good thing to do, and why I think you should do it, and why your stage of career, I think, is the time where you should be thinking about it seriously. And I think there are 5 reasons in my head why you should communicate your science, and I'll take you through my 5 reasons. Interesting to know whether you think that's something you share at the end of the talk. So the first is pretty obvious, and it's to really promote your findings, get your research out there. Your university, wherever that is, has a desire to get their research mentioned out there, to do impactful stuff. And if you look at the media pages of your institution, you'll see stories like this. Here's 3 that I just grabbed from the University of Sheffield website yesterday. A variety of things. Universities are great places, they do great things, and as young researchers you should aim to get your stuff out where it's relevant. Not everything, but you know, the key findings now and again is a good thing to do. It's good for you, good for your institution. The second is to promote debate and provide some kind of independent comment. And you probably don't have to watch the news for very long to see that these faces pop up, not just me, but experts. The experts pop up to explain what's going on in the world. And that's actually a very important role, I think, to unpack some complicated bit of research finding as an expert in your area and to distill it in a way that members of the public can understand. And can I say at this point, in your world, I am a member of the public because I don't know anything about carbon capture and storage. So it's not related to our level of education. It's related to our sphere of expertise. So I'm an expert in sperm male reproduction, and that's what I comment on. You will be an expert in a specific aspect of carbon capture and storage, I assume. And if called to arms, I think this is a really good thing to do to explain what's going on in a new piece of research and to help other people that are not in that area understand it better. Part of the reason for that is to influence policy and debate, and that's the 3rd reason that I think it's important to get involved. And here's a quote from Margaret Somerville, who's a bioethicist from Australia. And she makes the point that science time, medical time, business time, political time, and ethics time are on different scales. And scientific discoveries threaten to outstrip the efforts to place their application in an ethical context. If you wait until the last moment to start talking about your stuff and what it means and why it's important, you've waited too long. We should be talking about where the world may be going at a much earlier stage. So engaging with the debate through whatever medium possible is a good thing to do at an early stage. So you can socialize your ideas and socialize the context. Why should people be bothered about sperm? Well, there are lots of reasons. I haven't time to go through them now. But if we don't talk about it, then when a major crisis happens or something needs to be solved in Parliament or in the world, it's too late to begin that discussion. I would argue the same is probably true in your fields as well. We should be talking about carbon capture and storage now, even though we may not know how to do it, or so on and so forth. We've had an example of that in the UK recently. So this thing, mitochondrial donation to get rid of mitochondrial disease. We were talking about our desire to do it 20 years ago, and then finally it went to Parliament. The law was changed, it's now permitted, but had we not had that 20-year debate, this would have not gone through Parliament in the way that it did. The next one is to educate and entertain, and this is where it gets a bit odd and sometimes a bit scary. Should you really enter the world of these kind of television programs that are designed primarily to entertain? I would say yes, because it can bring great joys and get your science out there in a interesting and meaningful way. In 2009, I did a program for Channel 4 called The Great Sperm Race. It went around the world. It had huge impact, and it turned into an impact case in the ref in 2014. Had I not had the bravery to step forward and get involved in that program at an early stage, then it would never have been an impact case. So although it was a lot of stress, took a lot of time, it was a good thing to do ultimately, because the rewards were reaped in ways that I hadn't imagined at the beginning. And finally, I think it's an obligation. Talking to the public, talking to other people, having a two-way conversation with society about your research is something that I think is expected now of science. And this is a quote from a House of Lords report in 2000. It's an obligation to the fact that we use lots of public money to do our research. And so we should step forward and communicate our science when asked to do so. So that's my rationale for doing it. I think there are some very selfish reasons as well. The evidence out there, and I haven't time to go into this paper, but it's the references there if you want to look at it. It's been shown that if you communicate your science and get it out there in the world, that it increases your citations. As an academic, we shouldn't be just ruled by citations, but of course we kind of are. So talking about your research is a good thing to do from that perspective. The public have a great thirst for knowledge about science. Ipsos Mori did a poll in 2014. I haven't seen a more recent poll than that, but it shows that the public have a great thirst for science. And at that point, their primary route for science knowledge was through TV and newspapers. I suspect that has changed now, given the growth of social media. This isn't a training course, as far as I'm aware, but there is a lot written about modes and models of science communication. What I'm doing to you now is probably the least effective way of communicating science to a general audience. This kind of dialogue between myself and you works in a university environment, but talking to members of the general public, it can be very different. So there are different models. Getting science into soap operas, getting science into debates on TV is a much more productive way of doing it, because people don't actually realize they're digesting science at the point that they see a science story on Emmerdale or Hollyoaks or whatever. So working at that end of the spectrum, the right-hand side of that model is a good thing to do. And that's where I would say social media sits. And you are of an age and where social media is now pretty prevalent. So I would argue that's a good route for you to talk to members of the public. There are my socials if you want to talk to me, but there's a whole range of things out there that you can use. And I would argue that if I was your age again, this is what I would be throwing myself into, hook, line, and sinker. It can have perils. Talking to the public, the non-expert, can have perils, and I think you have to be careful. As I say, this isn't training that I can give you. That needs a lot of time. But just one example. Does anybody remember this? Does anybody know what that is? If we were in a lecture theatre, I'd ask you to shout it out.
Boaty McBoatface.
This is Boaty McBoatface. This is what happens when you talk to the public directly and ask them to get involved in science. So if you remember, the National Natural NERC, I can't remember what it stands for, Natural Environment Research Council wanted to name its new polar research ship. And so they launched a public competition to name it. And the top answer, as the gentleman just said there, was Boaty McBoatface. What a PR disaster, or was it? They actually called it Sir David Attenborough in the end, and Boaty McBoatface was given to one of the submersibles on board. But in a House of Commons report, subsequently, they looked at this, and I thought this was really, really nice. And the quote from the report is, "The entire nation has been discussing a polar research ship, and they've all heard of NERC. How many other scientific research councils could they name?" So out of what seemed to be a humorous competition, and a silly name, actually came a lot of interest in polar research and polar ships and research councils. So, you know, there are often wins that you don't anticipate when you start on this journey. And therefore, I would argue that as long as you're careful, having a direct line of communication with the public is rewarding and worth doing. So I hope that gives you some context. Happy to answer questions. Again, after this session, if you want to get in contact, there's my social medias or email the traditional way if you want to. Happy to take questions now from anyone should you wish. And if I've got the right button, I will stop sharing. There we go. Thank you.